Here, class, is another T account or balance sheet. And so let's look at this. We've added another layer to it. Let's look at our liability side. We have a demand deposit of 1,000. We got required reserves of 200 that we see right there. And so thus, 200 of 1,000. We now know our reserve ratio is, you got it, class, 20%. I'd like to go ahead and find that out. Really quick, what is the amount of our actual reserves or just reserves? That is also 200 because it's required plus excess. So required plus excess is your total reserves. It's 200. Notice they've loaned out all their money. They've loaned out all their money. There's nothing more they can loan out. Remember, these loans, anytime you see loans, that money's gone. Now, you see owner's equity, that's under liability, because owner's equity is basically the owners of the bank. They own the chairs, they own the computers in the bank, things like that. It's what's owed to the owners. And you'll see that sometimes it really is never involved in any of the equations, so don't really worry about that. And then we have a bond. They actually own a bond worth $5,000. They probably bought it from the U.S. Treasury. And it's really through the buying and selling of bonds through banks that the Fed is able to increase the money supply. And this is what we're going to look at today. So this is kind of where we are. Let me scoot on down to the second part of this. All right, so now assume that the Fed or central bank purchases $5,000 worth of bonds. So they're going to buy all of these bonds. And so that becomes zero. And now, since they bought the bond from the bank now has $5,000 in cash. Where does that go? Is it a demand deposit? It is not, I repeat, not a demand deposit. So all $5,000 of it can go into excess reserves. Remember, required reserves are only taken out on demand deposits. So you can put all $5,000 into excess reserves, and thus the bank can loan out all 100% of that to the public if they so choose. So your new T account would look like this, kind of a little bit neater right here. Now our actual reserves after the Fed's bond purchase would be, our actual reserves or total reserves would be 700. Notice we still are 20% of our demand deposits. So it is pretty much nice and neat right here. So here's our question that we've seen before, all right, which is, if the Fed buys $5,000 worth of securities, remember securities is the same name as bonds, from Sailor's Bank, what is the maximum change in the money supply from the bond purchase? Just from that $5,000. So language is important here. So we go 1 divided by 0.2 times our excess reserves of 5,000. So 1 over 0.2 is 5. 5 times 5,000 is, so the maximum change in money supply or potential loans is $25,000. All right, so good work right there. And what we do is we introduce bonds into the equation. And this could, go other ways too. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at some practice problems that they could fit into the FRQ. So let's work through these here. Assume a reserve ratio of, this is also in your workbook, of 10%. If a person deposits $500 into a bank, what is the maximum change in money supply, assuming no excess reserves? Now, that phrase, assuming no excess reserves, means this, and it messes with people all the time. All it is saying is that they will loan out all of their excess reserves, leaving no excess reserves from the $500 deposit. That's all it means. So what happens here is, with the deposit, 10% of that goes into required reserves. This is where people mess up. So that would be $50 goes to required reserves, and $450 goes to excess. And then we do our math, 1 over, which is the multiplier, times 450 equals Remove that. Equals $4,500. All right, let's keep it going. Number 2. Assume a reserve ratio of 20%. If a person deposits $500 into a bank, what is the maximum change in demand deposits? Not the money supply, but demand deposits. So there's an idea out there that what happens is that people will take out a loan, and when they get loaned that money, they'll redeposit it into the bank, and a bank will then loan out that money, which will then be redeposited. So if we were to do just this particular question on demand deposits, you don't have to. It's 1/0.2 times the demand deposit to get the total change in demand deposits, which should be 2,500. So you got to say, are they asking about change in money supply or change in demand deposits? If it's change in money supply, they have to take out the required reserve. That's why it's times 450. But since this says change in demand deposits, it's only times 500. So there we go right there. Let's do this. Assume a reserve ratio is 10%. If a person deposits $500 into a bank, what is this is key right here, initial. Initial means, oops, I'm having lack of room. First change in the money supply, assuming no excess reserves. So what's the maximum change? No, I don't want to say maximum. What's the first increase in the amount of loans from the $500 bank? Well, the excess reserves from this, well, we know it's 50 goes toward required, and 450 goes toward excess reserves. So the first change in the money supply, assuming no excess reserves, is going to be 450. I know it's weird, but number 1 is the money being loaned out, deposited, loaned out again, deposited, loaned out again. That's what number 1 is assuming. Number 3, they just want to look at the first loan, which would be 450, which is the amount of the excess reserves. Hopefully that makes sense. Assume a reserve ratio of 30%. If the Fed buys $1,000 worth of bonds from a bank, what is the maximum change in the money supply? So we're going to go 1/0.3 times 1,000. Now remember, they can loan out all this amount of the bonds right here, this $1,000. They can loan out the full amount of it. Why? Because it is not a demand deposit. You only have to take out the required reserves when it is a demand deposit. This is not a demand deposit, so they can loan out the full amount. So the answer is something like this, okay? I mean, this would be the point. Yeah, something like this. You got it? So those are some practice problems, getting used to some language like initial, no excess reserves, what that means, and some different problems. And we looked at a T account with, of course, our bonds involved over here. So we did a lot of good stuff today, guys. And we really can start getting into some FRQ practice. Always text me if you have any questions or send me an email. All right, take care.